Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today is going to be the first episode of my new series called True Crime Tuesdays. So in these videos we are going to be covering true crime, mainly focusing on Canadian true crime, since there is not a lot of videos, at least from what I have seen on YouTube, covering cases that have happened in Canada. So we're going to be focusing on murders, serial killers, interesting just true crime events, missing people, anything that's kind of piques my interest and I feel like needs to be spoken about more and have more people learn about it. So yeah, let's get into our first case.
Classic psychopathic personality.
It was the wettest, limpest, grossest thing I've ever felt from a man in my life.
So today we're going to be talking about Willie Picton, also known as Robert Pickton. He is a very infamous serial killer from British Columbia. This was really big in the late 90s and early 2000s. He is thought to have killed almost 50 women. So it's a super big case and it's really interesting. I found it very fascinating. It is a very large case, so there's a lot of names and a lot of information. So I'm going to do my best to break it down as easily and digestible as possible for everyone. So let's go and get started. Willie was born on October 24th, 1949 in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. He was born to Father Leopold and Mother Louise. He had one older sister named Linda and a younger brother named David. When Willie was born, he actually was born with his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. This led his family to believe that he suffered some brain damage. This was never confirmed by doctors, just his family's speculation. Willie's upbringing was said to not be an easy one. His family ran a pig farm where all the children were expected to work on. The children started working at the farm from a very young age. They were expected to work the farm before and after school, and of course on weekends. Willie's father, Leopold, was allegedly abusive towards his children. Allegedly, the children often received beatings from their father. They never knew what would set him off, so it could be something that they said, or just messing around in the house. This could potentially have led them to upsetting their father and them receiving a punishment for it. Linda, the oldest daughter, actually had a really quite good life at the home. She was always clean, she always had clothes, she was allowed to attend birthday parties and go hang out with friends, whereas Willie and his younger brother David were not given that same treatment from their parents. The boys often went to school dirty, they didn't have clean clothes, they rarely had proper lunches as well. In one way or another, the children were facing some abuse at home or negligence at home, whatever you want to call it. Despite all the abuse that Willie faced at home, he was known to be a very well-natured and kind child. His teachers always commented on how sweet he was and how kind he was, and same with his classmates. He never really had friends at school, but he was always nice to everyone that he spoke to. Unfortunately for Willie, at school, he was extremely bullied. Like I said, he always came to school dirty and always smelled like manure because at home, his parents actually let the livestock roam through their house and never cleaned up after them. So there was always manure and dirt and hay kind of all over the house, which obviously made things smell. So he got picked on for that at school a lot. Additionally, he had a stutter and a speech impediment. And kids are mean and find things to make fun of you for, so unfortunately he was very bullied for that. This caused Willie to become very closed off and very quiet and keep to himself. He didn't really have any friends at school. He really just stuck with his brother since he was bullied as well. Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate, but that's just how it is. Willie did struggle a lot at school as well, not just with his peers, but also with his schoolwork. So Willie actually failed grade 2 and grade 3 multiple times. His teachers also commented that he wasn't a very bright kid. Again, this could potentially be linked to the fact that he did have his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck when he was born. This was in the almost 50s, so medical care obviously isn't the same then as it is now, so it could be a possibility, but we don't know for certain. Unfortunately for Willie, no matter where he turned or who he turned to, he was faced with bullying and abuse. In 1963, at the age of 14, Willie dropped out of school for good. After Willie dropped out of high school in 1963, he actually went on to go get a job as a butcher's apprentice. He worked at the butchery for many years until 1970 at the age of 21, when he finally decided to leave the butcher shop and come back home and work at the farm with his family. For almost a decade, Willie worked at the farm with his family, butchering, taking care of the livestock, and just taking care of the farm overall. It was then in 1978 that Willie's father, Leopold, suddenly passed away. He got hit again in 1979 when his mother actually passed away. He really loved his mom and he was really close with her. Yeah. As most parents do when they pass away, Willie's parents had an inheritance set up for all three of their children. Linda and David had access to their inheritance right away, but Willie would not be allowed to access his inheritance for another 12 years when he was 40. This was incredibly angering for Willie. He just lost both of his parents, and his parents felt like they couldn't trust him with his money for some reason, so they wouldn't allow him to access it. Also, the farm kind of got divvied up between the three children. Initially, David and Linda did not want to keep the farm. They wanted to sell it, take their money, and just move on with their lives. But Willie didn't really have anything else in his life. He didn't have any children, he didn't have a partner, and he really loved this farm. This was his pride and joy. So Willie kind of fought really hard to convince his siblings to keep the farm, and finally his siblings relented. So Linda got bought out and David and Willie kept the farm. David and Willie had an agreement that Willie would be in charge of all the operations. He would be in charge of butchering and maintaining the farm. David would be in charge of the financial aspect of it. Starting in 1979, when the boys took over the farm became less about pig farming, and the boys started becoming more involved with criminals. Willie and David often hired drug addicts and sex workers to come work at his farm. The boys offered a great pay and often bought drugs for their employees. Willie did still have pig and cattle that he would take care of and that he would butcher, but that was not their main source of income. David became heavily involved with the Hells Angels, which is a Canadian biker gang. It is said that David really looked up to the Hells Angels, that he really admired them. So when the Hells Angels finally involved themselves with the farm, it was a really, really big deal for David and Willie. I'm not certain what crimes the Hells Angels may have potentially been a part of through the farm, but we do know that they did use the farm as a place of operations, so we can kind of use our imagination about potentially what had gone on there. Through the late 80s and early 90s, the Pickton farm had become a place where hundreds of people frequented for massive parties that the boys threw. Imagine your generic biker gang party, so people from all walks of life attended. This became quite disruptive to the local community, which led people to complain to the police department multiple times. The Vancouver police were well aware of the Pickton farm and kind of the comings and goings of the Hells Angels and the parties, but the VPD was not very inclined to investigate them deeper because they were actually investigating another murder investigation at the time. So they kind of were more focused on getting that solved and dealing with that than the big parties that were happening at the Pickton farm. Through the years, the farm came more and more unkempt. Discarded vehicles littered the farm, the barns were falling apart. The farm was never well kept to begin with, but it had never gotten this bad in the past. I just want to add in here that the boys had a lot of money. David had multiple businesses in construction, and they actually sold portions of their land in the early 90s to developers, where they made roughly $5 million. So they had money to clean up and keep the farm nice and organized, but they chose not to. For over a decade, Willie and David were involved with the local biker gang. They were throwing parties and buying drugs and alcohol for their employees. Not once did the police visit them in that time, despite the community coming forward multiple times to make complaints against the Pickton farm. I imagine this created almost an invincibility complex for the Pickton brothers. I think that Willie started to feel invincible because he knew that the police were aware of what was going on, but nothing was ever done about the crimes and just the disruption that they were creating. Also, because Willie bought alcohol and drugs for his employees, I'm sure this made Willie feel like he had complete control over them, and that they would do anything for him because he was enabling their addictions. So I think in a way, Willie felt very much in control and very much in charge of everything that was going on in his life, which I think kind of pushed him to take his crimes to the extreme. So let's dive more into that. From this point forward in the case, there is a lot of information and there are a lot of names. I'm going to do my best to be as clear and concise as possible for you. If you have any questions, just feel free to leave them in the comments below and I will answer them for you. The first known attack. In the evening of March 22nd, 1997, Willie began his search for his victim in the downtown east side of Vancouver. After driving around for quite some time, he finally picked his victim as 31-year-old mother of two, Wendy Eistetter. Wendy, who went by Stitch, was a sex worker in the area. Unfortunately for Stitch, she fit his MO perfectly. She was addicted to drugs. She was between the ages of 20 to 35, and she was a sex worker. Willie proceeded to pick up Wendy and strike up a conversation with her. He requested that she, get in the car, that they would go back to his home in Port Coquitlam, and offered her an additional $200 to incentivize her. Initially, Stitch said no because Port Coquitlam is about a 20 to 30 minute drive from the downtown east side, so that was just too far for her to be comfortable, but Willie offered to drive her to his home and drive her back to the east side and again give her that $200. Stitch finally agreed and got into the truck with Willie. As they were driving to Willie's trailer, Stitch started to get really uncomfortable with Willie. During the drive, Stitch actually found a discarded women's bra that was on the floor of his truck. When Stitch picked it up and asked Willie, hey, what is this? He said, oh, it's just from a date that I had earlier in the day. It's nothing, don't worry about it. Stitch, trusting her gut, was like, I don't know, something doesn't feel right, this doesn't feel right. So, what can she do? She's in his car at this point, he's in control of the situation and she's really just there along the road. So eventually they get to the farm and Willie takes her to his trailer. They walk through the trailer together and, she takes note of the kitchen and all of the stuff laying around, and eventually they walk all the way back to his bedroom, which is at the very back of the trailer. And when she walks in the room, in his bedroom, she finds a roll of plastic that is laid out on the floor and a sleeping bag in the corner. Those are the only items that Willie had in his room at this time. This sent alarm bells ringing in Stitch's mind, and she was very scared. She was very uncomfortable. So she kind of turned around and said to Willie, oh, hey, can I use your phone to call my boyfriend just to let him know where I am and that I'll be on my way soon? Willie agreed, and he walked her to his phone and gave her the phone book. So as Stitch was holding the phone ready to dial, she was flipping through the phone book looking for the motel's phone number that her boyfriend was staying at. And she got this feeling that someone was standing behind her. And we all know that feeling when you feel that someone's watching you and it's uncomfortable. So Stitch, swung around to see what was behind her, and Willie was standing behind her. She obviously jumped back and asked him, you know, what are you doing? And it was then that Willie grabbed her wrist and started caressing her arm, and Stitch, being very confused, is kind of just standing there. And it was then that Willie slapped on a pair of handcuffs on her wrist. Immediately, Stitch was like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? You know, he's gonna murder me, or he's gonna assault me, like something is gonna happen, but I'm not gonna let it happen to me. So Stitch takes Willie to the ground and they start rolling and fighting. They're kicking and punching one another. They're both trying to take control of the situation. And Stitch remembers that when she walked past the kitchen, there was actually a butcher knife on the counter. So she rolls them over that way to the kitchen, where she's able to reach up and grab the knife. And it's then that she wields it against Willie, and they're both fighting, rolling, still fighting against one another. And during that altercation, Willie was actually able to wrestle the knife from her and use it against her. Fortunately though, Willie did sustain injuries, bad enough that he let her go, and you know, she was still holding the knife, and she raced for the front door, flung it open, and did not look behind her, and just ran all the way to the road. She was covered in blood and carrying a bloody knife. She was calling out for help for anyone who would be driving by to, you know, stop and help her. It was then that a woman named Maria Mills saw Stitch on the side of the road, covered in blood. She slowed her vehicle down, and Stitch walked across the road and slumped against her car and said, please help me, please help me. And Maria said that when she looked at Stitch and she saw her holding the bloody knife and the blood all over her, the multiple stab wounds, that she knew in her gut that something evil had happened, that this wasn't a prank, and that this woman really did need help. So Maria opened the vehicle, got Stitch into the car, which they then drove away to somewhere safe, where Maria was then able to dial 911 and get Stitch rushed to the hospital. During the fight, Stitch sustained multiple stab wounds and lacerations. Overall, Stitch was stabbed 4 times, twice in the abdomen, once in the rib cage, which actually punctured her lung, and she got a laceration on her arm. So like I said, Willie also received some injuries from the altercation, and he was actually able to, you know, pick himself up and get into his vehicle and drive himself to the hospital. Coincidentally, they both ended up at the same hospital. So they were both rushed in, of course. They were treated right away, and due to the nature of their injuries, a RCMP officer was dispatched to come and speak to each of the victims to kind of figure out what had happened and piece the story together. So Stitch explained her side. You know, she was a sex worker. She had been picked up. This man attacked her, stabbed her multiple times, put handcuffs around her wrist, which, by the way, were still on there. They were still attached to her. And, you know, she just explained her side of the story. Of course, the RCMP officer is writing everything down. And they go and ask Willie what happened, and he obviously told a very different story. But the RCMP officer, smart man, he knew how to piece, 2 and 2 together. And he actually pat Willie down and found the key for the handcuffs in his pocket still. So Willie was arrested and charged for attempted murder and assault. I believe he actually had 3 charges, but I couldn't figure out what the 3rd charge was, but I assume it's something in the realm of assault and attempted murder. So, okay, now you're thinking, great, you know, this man tried to murder someone, he attacked her, he injured her, he would go to jail, and this is where the story ends. It doesn't. Okay, so unfortunately, despite having 2 eyewitness accounts and a weapon, because Stitch did drugs and she was a sex worker, in the police's mind, she wasn't a credible enough source to talk about what happened to her. So the charges were never pressed and he was not taken to court. He was let go, free to go home and continue living his life, even though he almost murdered a woman. Yeah. At the time in 1997, police were not really concerned with sex workers and obviously their safety, as we can see in this example. And it's unfortunate because we as viewers have hindsight, and we know that had Willie been arrested and put in jail for his crimes, dozens of women would still be alive today. But police are not armed with hindsight moving forward. The Vancouver police became aware of Willie in 1997 after his incident with Stitch. Despite the police moving forward without prosecuting Willie, there was one officer who was a little bit more intrigued and wanted to take a deeper dive. His name is Constable Dave Dixon. He was a beat cop who worked in the downtown Vancouver East Side for over 20 years. He was very familiar with the community, with the general goings-ons, the in and outs. You know, when you work somewhere for that long, you tend to know what is going on. So when Constable Dixon started to notice that women were going missing, he started to get a little bit concerned. Now, it wasn't unusual for people to come and go from the downtown east side, to pick up and move, to go to different cities. It wasn't uncommon. However, the amount of women that were leaving and not returning was quite staggering. It wasn't just Dixon who had noticed all these women going missing. People in the community were starting to take note as well. Over several months, Dixon wrote down the names of women who were going missing and were not seen again. His list was constantly growing. Dixon knew a lot of these women were receiving social security checks, so he contacted the ministry to see if these checks had been picked up. When the ministry finally returned his phone calls about his inquiries, he found out that their files had actually been closed because it hadn't been picked up for quite some time. Dixon also started calling the local women's shelter to see if perhaps these women were in the shelter, and these women were not in the shelter either. So with these two big pieces of evidence showing that these women were, missing and nowhere to be found, he actually took this information to his superiors. And unfortunately, at this time, his superiors didn't feel that there was enough evidence or enough information to build a case off of. They were missing women that some were reported and some were not by family members. So in the police's mind, it was too much of an expenditure to just start investigating. Dixon knew that something wasn't right. He felt it in his gut. He couldn't shake it. So Dixon actually took it amongst himself to go to a statistics analyst that was working with the Vancouver Police Department to get an accurate number of how many women had gone missing in the years prior to compare to the missing women in the last few years. From the years 1978 to 1994, there were 1 to 2 reported missing women that were never found again. From the years of 1995 to 1997, 31 women had gone missing and were never found again. Now, when Dixon brought this information to his superiors, this is when his superiors really took an interest in the case and decided that perhaps there was something here that needed to be investigated. The police began their investigation, but unfortunately it was incredibly difficult because there was no evidence and no information. If someone was abducting these women, they didn't know who it was, when it was happening, or how it was happening. They had nothing more to go off of other than names of missing women. They reached out to people in the communities, to family members, and to other sex workers to see if anyone had seen anything, if anyone had heard anything, to try to really canvass the area to start their investigation. They knew that all the women who had went missing were sex workers, so they made it a priority to speak with other sex workers to make sure that if they had seen anything suspicious, that they were able to get that information and kind of compile it to create the base of their case. Along with getting as much information and evidence from individuals as possible, the police also started a suspect list. Now, there were dozens and dozens of people who were on this list. They included, names of people who were charged with assault, with murder, anything that related to violence. Their name was on this list. And among the names on that list was Willie Picton. Despite the run-in Willie had with Stitch in 1997, there were people who were higher priority on the suspect list because they were convicted of murdering sex workers. So he wasn't the top guy in their mind. Willie wasn't the most likely person they suspected of abducting these women. At this point in time in the investigations, none of the witnesses from the Pickton farm had come forward yet. You'll hear more about that in a little bit. I do want to express that at this time, the police were aware of Willie, but they couldn't spend all of their time investigating him because there was no evidence to suggest that he was the perpetrator of these crimes. This case was gathering a lot of media attention from Canada and also in America. America's Most Wanted actually did a segment on the missing women in Vancouver, and at the end of their segment they had a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest. This really amplified and politicized the case. Marches and protests were happening in Vancouver, advocating for these women to be found, urging police to work harder and investigate harder. But like I said, there was no evidence of these women being taken. There was no signs of struggle. There was no crime scene. There was nothing for them to go off of, anything more than, here are the names of all these women who are going missing, and they know that they're going missing, but they don't know where they're going. They don't know what's happening to them. This was the beginning to a very challenging case that spans for the next 5 years. A man by the name of Wayne Lang had taken a personal interest in the missing women's case. This is because Wayne had a very close and personal working relationship with one of the missing women named Sarah DeVries. Sarah was among the 31 missing women, and Wayne was one of her best customers. Over time, Wayne and Sarah grew incredibly close. They actually have developed a really beautiful friendship. So when Sarah went missing, it was very, very noticeable for Wayne, and he couldn't just let it go, and he couldn't just sit there and sit by and do nothing while his really good friend was missing. So Wayne took it upon himself to actually set up a tip line. And of course, a lot of the information in the tip line was fake, or, you know, people were pulling pranks, or it was a hoax or whatever, but Wayne never lost hope. He kept that tip line going. He was constantly on the phone talking with potential witnesses and gathering information for the police. And it was then that Will actually received a credible tip over the phone. The man who called in this tip was named Bill Hiscox. Now, who is Bill Hiscox? Bill Hiscox was a mutual friend of an employee at the farm, and he came forward and said that at the farm, when he was in Willie's trailer, that there was a lot of discarded women's clothing, there was women's identification, and other miscellaneous pieces of women's things that, you know, why would that be in a man's trailer who didn't have a girlfriend, who didn't have kids? It was just very odd. Bill also said that he got a really bad feeling from Willie and that someone should just check him out just in case. The mutual friend that I was telling you about that's friends with Willie, her name is Lisa Yields. So she is actually one of Willie's closest friends and closest associates. She had worked on the farm for the last few years, and she was known to be a really hard worker. She was very familiar with the Pickton brothers and the operations, and Willie and David really considered her to be someone very close to them. It was one day that Bill and Lisa were having a conversation where Lisa said, quote, "This is where all of those missing women are going," end quote. Lisa also told Bill that Willie had requested she burn all of the identification, the miscellaneous items, and the women's clothing. So when Bill was told this is when he decided to come forward and bring this up. So Lisa was brought in for an interview with the investigators, and it was then that Lisa denied ever having this conversation. She said that he can't be believed. This conversation never happened. Nothing's gone on at the farm. She's never witnessed any criminal activity. She knows nothing and has seen nothing. Police can't really do much at this point, right? There is no evidence, nothing, and they had someone come in and deny the allegations, so they have to continue moving forward in their investigation and continue investigating all the other suspects on their list. At this point in 1998, the police were really struggling with gaining any more information for their case. There was no new evidence. They had more missing women they were learning about. So unfortunately, the case kind of got put on hold for a little while. Investigators were kind of reshuffled out into their departments, but one additional officer was put onto the missing person task force. So there still was an investigation, it was just way more scaled down than it had been in the year prior. So now we are moving on to 1999. From January to December 1999, a lot of evidence, witness testimony, and police investigation would bring us that much closer to catching Willie and arresting him for his crimes. This is really when the pieces start coming together in the missing women's case. We have incriminating conversations that took place. We have an informant who was working at the farm and for the police. And we have an eyewitness testimony of a murder that happened in early 1999. The next few minutes of this case are quite graphic, so if hearing in detail about murder upsets you, then please skip to this time code. Hello everyone, Editing Deidre here. So I just wanted to quickly pop in and say that because this case is so big, it was actually too big to fit into one video. So there will be 2 parts. Part 2 will be up next week and it'll have all the juicy information that everyone is so looking forward to about the murders and all the eyewitness accounts that are very juicy. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks for tuning in, and like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that you can see part 2. See you next week.